You got a nice
Yeah.
cigar going, it looks like. What type of cigar are we rocking with tonight?
Foundation Tabernacle, one of my favorites. Foundation is kind of like a boutique brand. I wouldn't say they've blown up, but they've gotten more light shed on them over the past couple of years. Rogan's become a fan of them, and they're just good guys. Good guys. Great line of cigars.
Now, for somebody who doesn't know anything about cigars, and that's somebody, of course, being me, what are some of the makings of a good cigar? Like, let's say that somebody, I'm going to a cigar shop. It's my first time. I'm by myself. What should I ask for in terms of qualities?
Well, you're going to want to discover your flavor profile first, right? So you might want to start off light to medium, like a Connecticut wrapper is more light. For me, that's like a breakfast cigar, empty stomach with coffee. Or you might want to just try medium bodied smoke. The size matters too, right? They have different sizes. Churchill's really long. The shape matters. You can have a box press one. I like box press a lot. This is not box press. This is round. The box press are, as described, like flattened. They seem to have more of a cushion, a little more of a bounce. I think it's a fluffier smoke, little different type of draw. There's all kinds of things to look for, but you really just got to experiment and try it out, man. You start smoking within like 3 or 4 weeks. If you smoke, even if you're just smoking a couple a week, you'll start to discover what you like if you try enough things.
Did you start with the really high end stuff, or did you start with like I don't know, Captain Blacks, or I don't know if they have those in the States, but some of the gas
Oh hell
station
no,
stuff? No.
no, you can't smoke trash bags, man. You got to go to a premium cigar to back east, and you have to get real cigars. Doesn't have to be super expensive, but I mean, you're looking $8 to $12 a stick for the most part, right? Yeah.
I could see that.
You
Only the
can
best
get more,
around here.
this is probably like 13 and a half, something like that. But this, was really long a couple hours ago, so it's got value.
It's been a good session, man. I like that quality all the way around. So what's been happening, man? Obviously, it's been a little while since we chatted. For anybody who's really been following the show, we had our man Andrew on when he released his book, Failure Rules. Which, by the way, I mean, super fascinating book still to this day. I was going back and looking over some of the lessons from the book. Maybe if you could talk to the people about your journey since then, and also, looking back on the book after a year or two, how it's been in terms of a process.
Yeah. So it came out end of 2022. So September 2022. Prior to that was like a year and a half process of editing and, shaping the manuscript, rewrites, all of that after 7 years of, self edits. Then I worked with a team of editors at Scribe Media, which was the company that was originally started by Tucker Max, who wrote the book, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell, big bestseller. And they were great over there. And, after a year and a half, I think the manuscript was very good, obviously, before I hired them to work on it. But then I think they really refined it and brought it to be really great and have it be the best that it could be. And then it was like really just all about the marketing, right? So I set up all the infrastructure in terms of like brand identity and the website and all of that. And then it was setting up Amazon ads, doing the podcast and media tour. And that was pretty impactful. Both of those threads were impactful. And I just had a blast going on all kinds of different podcasts. I mean, been on everything from like Real Talk with Zuby, who, months later had Elon Musk on his show with an in-person interview, and was on Unlocking Potential with Jeff Lerner, which is a good entrepreneur podcast. Was on, obviously, Cassius Morris,
That's
the
right.
amazing Morris. And This is Hardcore podcast, which is really big in the hardcore punk music scene. So that was a really, really meaningful one to me because I know the host and kind of grew up with him. And he's very influential in the hardcore music scene. So that was a really cool one. The Unmistakable Creative with Srinivas Rao, who is a writer that wrote the book The Art of Being Unmistakable, which was one of the books that influenced me to write Failure Rules. So having that conversation on his podcast was awesome. I write about him in the book, so that was a cool one. It was just, I had a blast. Been on like 50 to 75 or something like that, different shows. And now I'm kind of in a phase where it's like I built this footprint, sold thousands of books. I mean, nothing crazy, but got kind of like the foundation going. And now it's like I'm focusing mostly on converting this into a thread where I'm building a paid speaking career, right? So I'm in right now. I'm taking a course with the Speaker Lab, which is an online course to help you set up a speaker business run by Grant Baldwin, and I'll be finished that in January, and then kind of like working with a virtual assistant to get a speaking business up and going to go speak at corporates and associations and talk about the principles of failure rules and how high achievers can turn failure into reinvention. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And, in the future, I'll probably end up doing a podcast. But I'm just not ready for that yet. I'm not ready for that.
But you're getting plenty of practice in with 50 to 75 guest appearances.
Yeah.
I mean, what did you learn about that side of yourself in terms of a public speaker, in broadcasting from doing those appearances?
Well, it's interesting you say that because as I'm like preparing to be the speaker, which has more of an educational slant, more of like a concrete takeaway necessity to prepare talks, potentially convert them into workshops and that kind of thing, in more like a corporate environment or a keynote to an association. So it's a different application of the message. I do love the podcast the most because there's such a diversity. You never know what's going to happen. You're always meeting interesting people. It's an organic kind of conversation, and you could go anywhere. It's like I have a lot of different kind of niches that kind of hook into the book, like interests of mine, whether it's cigar culture, hardcore punk rock music, entrepreneurial thought, all these different things. So it's interesting. I'll go to cigar podcast and they want to talk about punk rock. Go to punk rock podcast, they want to talk about entrepreneurialism, right?
Right.
I'll go to entrepreneurial podcasts and they're like, what is this music and how does this connect to this message? So it's cool just seeing like the cross pollination of the different hooks from the book and meeting different people. And I don't know, I just find that the long form conversations are the best for both entertainment, information, insight, and application.
Okay, so you're touching on something cool here now because we always hear in business how people talk about the need to niche down, and a lot of people
Yeah.
have this theory. You know what I mean? That the more
Mhm.
niche you are and the more particular to one topic, the better your business will be. And something you've mentioned, and also I think I can relate in terms of my content. There's a lot of different niches and a lot of reach. How do you balance that? And what is your perception of the thought that the more niche, the better?
That's a great question because I thought about it a lot in the writing of the book. I wanted to be authentic and write
Yeah.
about what really interests me and connected to the broader topic so that it could be still kind of accessible to normies, but also very micro targeted to my interests. I mean, you think of like obviously everybody points to Joe Rogan, but you think of Joe Rogan, like what do you think of? There's like this trinity of like interests. You got comedy, UFC, and marijuana, right? So it's like he has these niches that connect him to very specific audiences, but he's also still very generally accessible, right? And so for me, those three niches that kind of like are the core trinity would be cigar culture, hardcore punk rock, and I guess entrepreneurialism or even like tattoo culture or what have you, right? A lot of the art in the book is kind of that aesthetic. But then it's still very, very broad, right? The topic of failure can apply to your personal life, your business life, general experiential failure that has nothing to do with your actions or pursuits, but it's just part of the human condition. And how do you deal with that and process that and reinvent and move on and live a life of flourishing? I definitely contemplated like that. How do I niche down but still be accessible to the normies and to a broader audience? And that was kind of the aim. I think I accomplished it, but over time we'll see if that's really the case. But yeah, I think that was the first time I heard that kind of the idea of niching down was on the James Altucher podcast, and I forget who his guest was, but it was a great podcast, and it really made me think deeply about how to approach the book. I'm not sure if are you familiar with James Altucher at all?
Maybe if I was to see him, but the
Yeah,
name, no.
yeah, Jewish guy, entrepreneur, real quirky, got a big afro, kind of like a Jew fro, glasses, really cool, really smart. Wrote a book called Choose Yourself, and that also was a heavy influence for me in writing Failure Rules. And so so niche down. It's definitely something to think about when you're creating art.
Yeah, but I mean, like you're saying, there's guys like yourself who've managed to do it, guys like Joe Rogan who obviously have many different niches, but I mean, it does seem like there's a connection there. So would you say that's key as well, having everything that you do sort of connect in one way or another in terms of interests?
I think so. They got to be authentic interests, though, right? Like even the niches themselves, like to me, like what's most interesting to me is people that have 2 to 3 niche interests that are disparate, but somehow work together for that person and their brand and their expression. Again, we just
Yeah.
mentioned UFC and marijuana and comedy. They have nothing to do with each other, but somehow they've come together, disparate niche interests, to be this unique kind of like composite for Joe Rogan. And so I think that is like a key to differentiation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned even in the last couple of minutes a few books that you've read that have been inspiring to you in one way or another. How many books would you say you find yourself reading per year?
Whew, well, not as many as I should. I snack on them simultaneously in parallel. So I'm usually reading like 10 books at once, and then they take a long time to finish. I might not finish all of them, but I'm kind of like siphoning off like from each one as needed, as kind of my, as my mood or interests, emerge, right? So I could be reading some fiction books, some nonfiction books. Like I think right now, like I just finished From Punk to Monk, which is the memoirs of Raghunath Kapo, who was a monk, Hare Krishna monk, Hindu monk. But first he was a punk rocker and sung in this straight edge hardcore band Youth of Today, who was well renowned. Then he started Shelter, which was a Hare Krishna punk band. Still sings that band today. And so this is like his journey to from going from punk to monk, and his like how he interspersed spirituality into his music, and how like he from being connected to the New York hardcore scene and meeting Harley Flanagan of the famous band the Cro-Mags, how that kind of got him interested in Vedic philosophy. So I'm like reading that, but then I'm also reading like Scott Galloway, The Algebra of Wealth. I really find Scott Galloway interesting. A lot of great actionable takeaways, particularly for like young men or women in their 20s and 30s who are just starting out and trying to think about their careers and how to like navigate maybe the desire to want to marry money with meaning and how to balance the two because you need both. And
Yeah.
some people chase one or the other at the expense of the other. And so I think that book's really interesting. Brad Stulberg is another artist or another author that I've really been into lately. Read a few of his books recently, but the one Masters of Change is really, really good. He just talks about, how trying to think the way that he sequences kind of the basic premise of the book. But it's essentially that you encounter change of some sort of magnitude that carries some weight, similar to like a failure rules concept, and it's disorder, and then so you have order, then you have disorder, and a lot of people try to go back to original order. They go back to trying to when things were normal to renormalize. And he talks about more how the idea is really to accept the disorder that comes into your life,
Right.
metabolize it, and then figure out how to reorder it into something
Mm.
net new that helps you grow and helps you become kind of the next more widened version of yourself. Very similar to concepts in failure rules, but said in a different way with a whole host of different, case studies. I found that one interesting. Also, my man John Joseph, singer, ex-singer for the Cro-Mags, triathlete, he just wrote a new book called Destroying Monsters, all about addiction and his personal stories of growing up in foster homes and being abused and in and out of prison and being homeless and how he turned all that around and became who he is today. And so that one's really, really good too. My son has gone through addiction, so I got a copy for him as well. So there's just, the other one too is 48 Laws of Power, Robert Greene. I always go back to that one because it's so damn thick and I'll never read it cover to cover. But
Yeah.
snacking on one and just finding different gems where you can just read a paragraph and it's so dense and it has so much to like meditate on, and you just pull that out and just think about that in your life. I mean, I forget which number it is, might even be rule number one, but the whole don't outshine the master one is very interesting, and
Yeah.
ideas about creating scarcity for yourself, which enhances and maintains your value in the world. And so I'm kind of all over the place, man. I know that was a long answer, but
That's a great answer. No, absolutely. I mean, I've actually been going through a lot of the Robert Greene stuff myself, and it's very interesting to hear his perspectives. And one of my favorite things in that book too was him saying that even with all these rules in the 48 laws, there's still exceptions to every rule in the sense that it's not going to be applicable to every scenario. That to me was key because I think when people take those rules too literally, it's
yes,
a recipe for disaster.
100%. And I'm glad you said that because it ties into my book, Failure Rules, the 5 Rules of Failure. People are like, so you have these rules. What do you mean by rule? I'm like, I just say rule because it's a play on rule words with failure rules, right? But
Right.
really, they're mindset guidelines that are like, cherry pick them and apply them when they're useful and when they apply. But they're not hard and fast rules, right? They're kind of like, uh, you know, lessons or mindset kind of principles that oft apply, but maybe not always. But you should think about them, think through them, and put it into your decisioning matrix when you're contemplating a big decision, or you've encountered a big disorder in your life, when the ground is shifted and things start to crumble and shift, and you got to reorder things and try to figure out how you're going to make that next version of yourself what it ought to be.
And I mean, you've spoken about that as well. The fact that you've had to sort of put your life back together in multiple scenarios. Was this concept of reordering your life something that you recently were tapped into, or were you sort of looking at things that way from the beginning when you had hardships?
It was just drilled into me through hardened experience, through blind wandering as an entrepreneurial adventurer in my 20s and my 30s. So, having, started out like, really from the moment I got married to my first wife, I came home to a pink slip and was laid off. I used that opportunity, that empty failure space, to act on a kind of muzzled desire of mine to start my own record label. So I maxed out my credit cards and signed a hardcore band and began my record label. 20 years later, I have two labels, over 100 recordings that I've released. But throughout that journey, there was all kinds of ups and downs. At one point, I had to go through a personal bankruptcy, which ultimately preserved the record labels. There was just all kinds of things to learn along the way. Also owned a fitness center, had a financial planning practice, had a lead generation company, wrote a spy novel, did bodybuilding competitions. So it was just all this like adventuring, right? All the stuff that really was unsafe. Failure rule number 2 is nothing is safe. And so, I think it was probably on the cusp of my 40th birthday. I was taking this Long Beach walk, and I was kind of walking through two twin failures. One was a business divorce at a company I was partners with somebody on, and there was a schism, and it was falling apart, and so I had to reorder my business life. And I was on the precipice of a marital divorce that was long, kind of brewing, and I was just thinking about all the things I'd gone through, and the Winston Churchill quote, which is success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. That came to mind. I was listening to a playlist with everything from Motorhead to Cro-Mags to all these other bands on it, and I just started jotting down all these ideas. And was just like on a digital sticky note, and then like later on, that became the genesis for the first draft of Failure Rules, which, as Hemingway says, all first drafts are shit, and it was. But over the years, as I rewrote and went back to it and returned to it, shaped it, it became not shit, right? So, yeah, I think it was just through hardened experience, but I knew that I was learning things. I knew that I was learning things that I was probably not meant to keep to myself. That the things that I learned, like if they were to have any value, they had to have more value than just what I was able to retain from them. And so I felt like compelled, like almost from like a spiritual, fulcrum to release them into the world. And that was really the drive for it. I think that has been the effect. That people have said that, some of the things in the book have really changed the way they think and changed their, actual decisions and actions in life for the better. And so, that's all you can hope for, right? It's really not about book sales or anything else. It's about, can you make meaningful impact in the world, with sharing your story or the insights you think you have.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we're talking about the book as well, because obviously a lot of people heard you on the show before and that they will have read it, but there's going to be new people here who maybe haven't read the book quite yet either. So, for the newer crowd, uh, going back to that point where you were going through not only the company issues with your business partner, but also the marital issues, did you ever get sucked into a depressed state or experience depression at that time?
Well, I think there was probably shades of depression, but most of it was just practical despair. Like, what do I do now? Where do I go from here? And so my spirit is more of one of like, I react with defiance. I react with like turmoil, but it's like a productive turmoil. Like, I'm going to figure this out, and I might have to isolate for a while. And maybe I drink a little too much when I do it. Maybe I go to the gym a little too much and get my aggression out. Maybe I listen to a little too much heavy music to work through this. But I'm going to deal with this crucible, and I'm going to make this failure rule, right? So I don't think depression is really the word. Cycling through natural sorrow because of external realities. occurred, but not really the depressive type, to be honest with you. I mean, even in the depths of despair, I'm full of gratitude, and I really invoke, PMA, positive mental attitude, because that's kind of the point. Like when I talk about PMA, positive mental attitude, which is an old Napoleon Hill concept, and was co-opted by the punk rock scene by bands like the Bad Brains and the Cro-Mags and H2O. When I talk about that, the whole value of it is to find PMA when nothing is positive in your life. Like it's easy to have
Yeah,
PMA when everything's great, but if you can
exactly.
invoke it and find that in your gut, in the basement, when everything around you is chaotic, that's when it has its value. And so for me, like that was my, my strength.
For sure. No, I think that's so important, man, because, I've been thinking about this concept lately as well. I definitely do believe in people being in depressed mind states or even,
Sure.
experiencing what they call
Yes.
depression. But my issue with the way it's handled in the Western world, at least, is that, we see it as a diagnosis with no cure. So people
Mm.
are like, you're depressed. Basically, the only answer is to take pills, and you're still probably going to be depressed. But I firmly believe that depression is a mindset that you could actually work out of by changing your external surroundings and also your internal thinking. That's just the way I view it at this point.
Well, I think there's something to that. I think there's also something very real about depression that is clinical and chemical, and is not something that someone can just, you know, um, think their way out of with rational thinking and rational action. But at the core of it, even when it's clinical and chemical, I do think that action always helps. Right,
Yeah.
taking small actions to try to get out of the mud that you're walking in always does help. Layering in new activity, building new foundations of thought, new foundations of action always helps. Even if you don't know where it's going, even if you absolutely don't want to do it. I mean, it's the old saying that I think Rich Roll, the podcaster, says a lot that mood follows action, right?
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
Brad Stolberg, who I mentioned before, says it in a different way. He says, you don't need to feel good to get going. You need to get going to give yourself a chance to feel good, right? And so
Right.
I think that really applies to depression, whether it's kind of a self-indulgent depression that's not clinically based, or a true depression that's clinically based, and that you're really having a hard time with, and you might even be using some medication. I still
Mhm.
think that action, no matter how painful, is the first step to really kind of contend with and combat depression.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think purpose as well is a big one. I think that a lot of people who are depressed don't have a sense of purpose. And I've seen it with people in my family, and
Mm.
it's the craziest thing is watching my sister, she was so depressed she couldn't even get out of bed there for a number of years. And then she became a mother, and now seeing her have the sense of purpose. And it's
Yeah.
funny, my mom said that her having a baby probably even saved her life.
Mm.
So it's an incredible thing to watch. But yeah, I mean, would you say that's a big one as well, having that sense of purpose in your life too?
Yeah, I think so. And my book deals with purpose a lot, right? And I really think that purpose can sometimes be ethereal. Like, okay, what is my purpose? And I don't know that people necessarily always have a singular purpose. I think that's very, very rare. Most of the time, people have different purpose or purposes at different seasons in their lives.
Yeah.
And sometimes their purpose isn't even clear as you set out on it, right? You might be setting out on something that had to do by necessity that then turns into your purpose over time, and you realize the value that it ends up, giving you as you get into it. Which again goes to kind of that blind action, that blind faith of just taking steps in some direction to see what stirs. But yeah, I think purpose is a big part of it. Makes me think of one of the stories in the book about Kamal Ravikant, the brother of Naval Ravikant, both Silicon Valley kind of figures. Kamal was, he was a CEO at one point and had failed, and his business had fell apart, and he was broke, and he got super depressed, couldn't get out of his bed, and was ignoring outreach from friends, falling into the abyss, living off his credit cards, and just hated himself. He was bereft of self-esteem, bereft of self-love, and kind of decided one day that he was just going to choose to love himself regardless of how he felt. So he actually didn't love himself, but he decided he was going to tell himself that anyway. And so it sounds kind of cheesy, but he did the whole look in the mirror affirmations and kept telling himself that every day, every day, every day, every day, every day. And that process ended up transforming him. He ended up writing a book called Love Yourself as If Your Life Depends on It. And that book was a very short book, but a powerful one. And he sold it for like $2.99, ended up selling 500,000 copies, which got him
Wow.
out of debt, got him out of, continued to get him out of depression. He now speaks, about suicide and stuff to audiences, and became an entrepreneur again and kind of refound his life. But it started from that decision to go against your feelings and state your own I am statement, regardless how you feel. And I think that is, a very important part, is really like having that third party observer perch that you view your own thoughts on, and realizing you are not your thoughts, right? You get to decide which thoughts to accept, which thoughts to attach to your identity, and which ones not to. It's difficult, but if you take that view and realize that every thought that comes into your head, that's not you, it's not who you are. We can't
Yeah.
control a lot of that comes into our heads, but we can control how we react to them, how we accept them or reject them. In the book, in Failure Rules, failure rule number 5 is you are not your failures. And it's the idea of decoupling your identity from your failures, that when you're in that failure space or experiencing a failure event, the only way you're really going to make it rule and discover the next best version of yourself that emerges out of that, and kind of discard old foundations and rebuild new ones, and get rid of old thinking and rebuild new thinking. And the way to really do that, um, is to not allow yourself to have your identity attached to the failure event, and detach from the negative optics of it.
Yeah, no, I love the comparison between thoughts and outcomes because, in the same sense that you're not generating your thoughts, you are basically witnessing them, or you're more of a bystander in your own mind for a lot of your thoughts. So you don't have to internalize them. But in the same sense, you're not generating the results of what happens when you try something. Ultimately, I mean, you are in a sense, because what happens ultimately depends on what you do, but not always, in the sense that like you could do everything right and still fail. So you're not necessarily coming up with this, and yeah, so to really detach the self from the
Yes.
result. That's fascinating.
It's very key, right? Particularly because if your goal is the outcome, you are setting yourself up for a lot of disappointment along the way. Because positive outcomes, for some people, they're not always rare, but for most people, they're kind of rare. It's the highlight reel, right? So you have to
Yeah,
find a game that you're willing to play and want to play for the sake of it, right? Or for some purpose that's less, tethered to an extraordinary outcome. And yeah, that's a big part of it. I mean, it's also the case too that people think that when they have bad things happen to them or failures in their lives, that it's always a result of, or many times a result of a bad decisioning. And sometimes it is, sure. Sometimes that can be very clear, like, oh, I made a bad decision with the information I had. But a lot of times we make the best decisions we can with all the information we have, even after having sought out as much information as possible. And even good decisions can lead to bad results because we live in a very unpredictable world. There are so many
exactly.
variables that contribute to the outcomes in our lives, that so much we cannot control, as the Stoics would emphasize, that we really cannot peg ourselves to these outcomes. Certainly, we want to be introspective, and if we could have gotten more information or made better decisions with certain information, we want to evaluate that and change go forward. But a lot of times, don't beat yourself up. A lot of the things that happen to you that don't work out still were likely made, with good decisioning rationale.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, and it's just like Steve Vai said on this show when he was on, he said, if you rely on your sort of the guessing game that you play in terms of whether or not something's going to work out, he's like, when you look back, you're going to see more often than not, your guess was incorrect. And you really have no way to predict the outcome of something. So going with it is really a better way. And also, again, yeah, like you're saying, not identifying with the result too much. Um, I
Yeah.
want to I want to add to that. So let's say during the wins, when something goes exactly your way, you get that deal, you get that contract, that job, whatever the case may be. Um, how do you balance taking the wins in stride as well? Because one thing we've seen is people go up too high. It either happens too fast or it's too big of a high, and then when things start to come down, that person has an epic crash.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? How do we remedy that sort of situation?
I mean, for me, knowing how much control I did not have on so much of the first part of my adult life or working life, my 20s and my 30s. I didn't really start to experience success continually until my 40s. And so that's been amazing. But I never forget the potential tumult that could befall me, particularly if I fall into hubris. Doesn't mean I'm not susceptible to it because I have a strong ego. I think most of the time a healthy ego, but like anyone who's an alpha, anyone who goes after it, anyone who does, in fact, truly love themselves as they ought, you can be susceptible to ego. I mean, it's like Ryan Holiday's book, Ego is the Enemy. It's often said that like ego is like fingernails. Grows quickly, needs to be trimmed often. So I always think of that, like make sure that I'm
I
always
like that
keeping that,
one.
like got to keep that in check because you can get above your skis. And next thing you know, you can actually be setting your own booby traps before you know it.
For sure. So it's about regularly checking in with yourself and maintaining that your sense of self is at a manageable level, so to speak. Because you have to have some sort of ego, like you're saying. You have to have the
Yes.
self love and the self worth, but it can't be, you know, so much that it becomes detrimental to the cause.
And the cause then is connected to purpose. And the best purposes usually are serving other people. And if they're serving other people,
Mm.
your ego doesn't have room in that scenario, right? Your confidence does, your commitment does, your enthusiasm does, your self love does, but the ego doesn't have room if your purpose is more attached to serving other people, right?
Hmm.
So that I think is a key part of it too, to kind of suffocate the ego susceptibility and just more wrap yourself in positive, healthy, confident self love, purpose, and drive.
What are your thoughts on the conundrum where somebody's ego actually becomes why they're successful or why they're liked? For example, you see somebody like a Howard Stern, you see somebody like a Kanye West. It seems like the
Or
more
Andrew
full of them,
Tate.
or an
Yeah.
Andrew Tate, exactly. Yeah, it's like the more full of themselves they get, the more big for their britches they get. It actually creates more popularity for them. But my observation for that has been that they often become so big that eventually they're going to make missteps because they can't be advised. What are your thoughts on that situation? Because it is a weird one.
Or it's just not sustainable. At some point, they're going to crack or end up being folded into some conforming zeitgeist or structure that's going to water down who they are. And then you see that who they are really is not as maybe wonderful as the manufactured persona or avatar, right? And so I think the most authentic, sustainable, influential people have confidence, but they clearly don't have ego. The people that kind of over the long tail continue to have impact. I mean, everybody from like I mentioned, Ryan Holiday or like even like a Jordan Peterson. Like they are. It's pretty clear that they're doing what they're doing because they really believe in a message that they think will benefit other people. And
Mhm.
if that's your goal, like again, like you might not have the same hockey stick growth of like algorithmic popularity, but over time, you'll make the impact you're supposed to make, even if
Yeah.
it's a little, you know, smaller of an audience. It's more about going deep and going wide.
How about entrepreneurship today in 2024, leading into 2025? Obviously we're seeing so many different voices. You mentioned a guy like Andrew Tate. We have the Grant Cardones of the world, and not to name anybody in particular, but we have many different voices who are very strong and opinionated in the world of business, telling young people how it ought to be if they're going to try to make a name for themselves. What are your thoughts on this sort of new culture that is seems to be plaguing my generation? Do you think they're dead on? Do you think there's misconceptions there, and why?
I think you just got to be careful about ever following one person, right? I
Hmm.
think you really got to be kind of like discerning and taking a wide array of virtual mentors and figure out for yourself which pieces fit best into what feels right for you. Um, but still like investigate, like still like listen to a lot of different voices and take them all in. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on any of them, right? Like some people are going to find value in some things Andrew Tate says and then discard the rest appropriately. Some people are going to find value in some things Jordan Peterson says and discard the rest appropriately. Same with whoever it might be. I'll just throw Ryan Holiday out there again because I mentioned him, right? Because so I think it's just a matter of like finding cherry picking what feels best for you and aligns most with your conscience. But it also goes back to this idea I talk about a lot too, which is building in margins in your life for dedicated time of solitude with the surplus, where you can really go deep into yourself and take inventory of your motives, take inventory of your actions, take inventory of your multi-year vision, take inventory of your relationships, of your talents and how they're being applied to the world or not. And if you're doing that on a regular basis, usually that's going to, also for many people, be connected to some sort of faith path, whether it's like my Hare Krishna friends or whether it's Christianity or a non-faith expression like, Stoicism practice, whatever it is. But, I think without that, it's easy for people to drift and not only drift away from like full living, but drift away from like, callings that they could be hearing on their lives that they should be acting on.
For sure. So, I mean, what for you would you say is that faith path?
For me, I'm not like a churchgoer or anything, but for me, it is contemplative Christianity,
Mhm.
but also informed by other wisdom literature, whether it be Hinduism or Buddhism or Stoicism or ancient Judaism, that aligns with and supports kind of the core values of the Christian tradition. So I take in a wide array, but for me, from like particularly from like a salvation standpoint, I would be a Christian.
It's funny, I saw something today that said that Bible sales have gone up 25% this year, and most of the people buying them are first time
Yeah,
purchasers.
I
I
didn't hear
wondered
that.
what, yeah, I mean, again, I would like to see the source of the stat, but, do you think there's some sort of revival when it comes to religion in general in the West? Because for me, at least, it feels like there's something brewing.
I think so. I think there's a more of an interest in spirituality that maybe originates from a more a a widening interest in meaning, right? So I think people are seeking meaning more, and they're seeking meaning through philosophy. They're seeking meaning through political ideology. They're seeking meaning through seeking out external material prosperity, and none of those things are I think complete. And so I think they're then swerving into okay. I've tried to find meaning and fulfillment in all these other areas, but I'm only getting so far. What are the missing pieces, and what is beyond that, potentially transcendent, that I can investigate and see might, complete the picture, complete this, kind of value structure I'm trying to build for myself.
Yeah. No, I can definitely relate to that looking around, at a lot of my peers and just seeing things that a lot of people go through nowadays that definitely rings true. As somebody who comes from the more traditional school of entrepreneurship and, what I would say is probably the better generation of doing, the field. What are your thoughts on like we're talking about the current generation of, 20 somethings who are trying to make a name for themselves? And maybe in your view, what would you say is the biggest challenge that you seem to see for this generation that they may not realize?
I mean, I think it's better than it was before, to be honest with you, because of the easily accessible variety of voices online. But I think the biggest challenge is really more parental views and the influence of family that might not have access to the wide array of like entrepreneurial thought that's out there, and might
Mhm.
still see it as, pipe dreams and too risky and not worth it, and go do something safe. And so I think it's really like it has to be a balance of contending with the practical realities of life and the economy, and also finding room for chasing after those things that burn inside. And so, like in my book, failure rule number 4 is build your thing one and thing two dependency. And your thing one would be like some sort of enabler pursuit that most stabilizes you, but also leaves room in your life to chase after your thing two, which is your aspirational dream pursuit. And so, the dependency between the two of them is a way to build some scaffolding to have a better chance of getting to your dream over time, as opposed to the burn the boats method of just, quit everything and just go after your dream, and you'll have no other options. You'll make it work. Some people
Yeah.
can do that. I think that's amazing when they do it. But I think for most people, that's probably not a wise path.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
it's
So
not great advice, unless you're talking to a
it's,
young Mike
yeah,
Tyson and you know you are.
unless there's, as Scott Galloway would say, unless there's real bright signs that you have a high possibility of succeeding in this isolated dream you're going after. But I do think that societal, parental, or the older generation's view of it is one of the biggest hurdles. I think that young people need to balance current realities with future dreams in such a way where they can do both. And that is terribly difficult, but there is at least enough role models and case studies and information out there to give you an approximate roadmap. And my book is one of them. That's one of the biggest kind of themes of the book, is how to think through those difficult, planning stages of your life.
What would you say was the biggest risk you ever had to take to become a successful entrepreneur?
Whew. Wow, there's so many of them.
Yeah,
Uh,
one of many.
yeah, I mean, maxing out my credit cards to start my record label. Later on, I
Right.
worked in the music industry, first for Relapse Records, like a well-known grindcore death metal label, and then also for a distributor that's now defunct, but Lumberjack Mordem, who had a deal with Warner. And I was a top salesman at the time, but my record labels were growing, and there was a tension between the two. I was doing both, and I made the leap to do it full time for my record labels. And it was risky, and I didn't really see some of the risks that were in front of me. And so I had a lot of trouble. And then there was a time when I was in the online lending business, and so you're issuing loans online, and you have to get investors, and you're utilizing investor money, and you're putting hundreds of $1,000s out there. And there was just the amount of risks were just everywhere. I mean, as
Yeah.
Elon Musk says, like, being an entrepreneur is like eating glass and staring into the abyss. I mean, that really is what it is. That's he could, nobody could say it better than Elon, right?
Right.
And
He would
that
know.
channel down to the microcosm of the very small entrepreneur with very reasonable, modest goals that still has that feel to it, which is it's part of the thrill, it's part of the challenge, and only certain people are made for it, I think.
That's so true. You mentioned a guy like Elon as well. One of the most fascinating things to me has been, watching in the last couple of years how he's become such a polarizing figure. But it seems like he was always polarizing in a lot of ways. I mean, what do you think it is about these strong entrepreneurial types that creates such a strong visceral reaction in people?
I mean, I write about this in my book too. I write about the topic of divisiveness, right? I mean, Rick Rubin, the great record producer, has said, great art divides. You either love it or you hate it, right? And he's produced records for people that are diametrically opposed from each other, either politically or religiously, whatever. You got, Kid Rock on one hand and Eminem on the other. You got Johnny Cash on one hand and you got Slayer on the other, right? So such diabolical, I can't speak, diametrical opposition, right, in sensibility. And that's true. I mean, great leaders, great entrepreneurs, great artists, they often divide. Otherwise, you're lukewarm. It'll get spit out. It's not really gonna hit. And so Elon's of that stripe, man. I mean, that's how he is who he is, and he takes those risks. I mean, even like regardless of how you feel, like even the political risk of him supporting Trump after the assassination attempt. I mean, that took balls for a guy like that, because he has enemies as it is, and they were just going to increase if Trump lost big time.
For sure. I mean, how do you think it looks for these guys who did endorse Trump? Elon Musk jumped in, Rogan jumped in at the very end. Do you think that the mainstream media, who's opposed to Trump in that side, are going to sort of take it out on them as the years go on? Because it seems like already there's been sort of a punishment that they're trying to give to these guys.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Anybody who stands in the way of what they want, they're going to try to punish, right? I think just for me, just from an outside objective perspective, having seen, presidents, everything from both the Bushes to Clinton to Biden to Trump to Obama, all of them, it seems to me that like what the American people seem to reject is fundamentalism of any stripe. So you have like kind of the trad Republican kind of motif, which was heavily dominated by, evangelical Christians. That over time now past the Trump Pence era now is like diminished, where you have the top people in Trump's team, they're all just Democrats who haven't really changed their beliefs. They've just now been embraced by the Republican Party. So the fundamentalism that might have been attached to the yesteryear evangelicals, or back in, I guess it was the 80s, the moral majority, I think it was called, with Falwell, that's all like decreased. And then on the left, you have the fundamentalism of wokeism, which has all the hallmarks of cultist religion. You're excommunicated if you disagree, right? It's very rigid. There's no forgiveness. Like, it's very, very rigid. So rigidity in both parties has been rejected. And I think you had these politically homeless people that used to find a place with Democrats, now seeing Democrats as illiberal, and Republicans having flexed and opened their tent, seeing Republicans as actually more classically liberal or traditionally liberal. And so I think like liberalism actually won, and fundamentalism on the right and the left lost. Just an observation.
Right. No, it's so fascinating when you look at it that way. And I mean, it's true. The terms of each party have completely shifted, it seems like, because now the Conservative Party is suddenly the party of open speech and free dialogue and open ideas. And the
And
Liberal
anti-war.
Party is now, what's that?
And anti-war.
And anti-war, yeah. And now yeah, exactly. And now the Liberal Party at least seems to be mostly looking at censoring speech and doing all that. So it's the opposite of what it's actually called. But I mean, the term that you used as well was fascinating: politically homeless people.
Yeah.
That's an interesting term, and I think that's a dead on point, that a lot of those people would just side with the left because it seemed like the more normal or the more sensible, responsible side, I think, was sort of the MO of a lot of undecided voters. But that seems to have changed.
Yeah. And I think the idea of being politically homeless is a good orientation. I mean, it goes along with like the non-attachment principles of Eastern thought too. Like, look, you're going to have these groups of people that are going to build a platform and say they believe in X, and maybe you align with them for a little bit, but then they're going to change, or you might change. And like, you just should not be like, I don't think you should be tethered to or dedicated to some sort of political party or ideology. You should be dedicated to always questioning yourself, questioning the parties, questioning the platforms, taking in new information, and being okay with changing your mind at different seasons in your life, or how that lines up with or doesn't line up with a platform of a party over time. Like, I think political homelessness is a great position to view the world from. Doesn't mean that you're detached, just means that you're not going to blindly follow anyone.
Yeah. No, I think
And we,
that's a big thing now.
and with a two-party system, it's hard for that position to be maintained by a lot of people, because they want to just have a team. You know, they want
For
groupthink.
sure.
They want a team. They want to
It's
follow. They
human
want,
nature. It's like a sports team, right?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's so true, man. I love it. Fascinating conversation here as always. Now, hopping over to a little bit of rock and roll, I wanted to get your
Yeah.
take on a couple things going on in the world of music. So AC/DC, of course, announcing that they're going back on the road 2025, man, the Power Up, I guess, part two tour. Um, so first reaction to them touring, Andrew, and let me ask you this. How old is too old for a band in the position of AC/DC? Are they still going to go out and nail it, or are they starting to push the envelope a little too far?
Well, I didn't hear this news. Is it Brian Johnson singing? Like,
It is.
he's doing it?
Yeah.
That's
They were
important.
saying it was going to be Axl Rose, but it turns out it's Brian.
I don't think Axel. I mean, yeah, the whole Axel Rose and ACDC thing, like, it just doesn't fit for me.
Yeah, I
He's
think
got his
this had their
own
time.
legacy that is totally separate. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't want to say that too old even exists for rock and roll. I mean, if Lemmy from Motorhead was alive, he would it would be blasphemy to say that you're too old to play, right? Like, you play till you can't. You just keep going, right? So I would go see him again. I don't think I've seen them since, honestly, it's been a long time. I think the last time I saw ACDC was maybe 96 on the Ballbreaker tour. I mean, it was a long
Wow.
time ago. But no, I say As long as you got life in your years, keep it moving, man. Keep going. And like there's songs like they'll find the energy in their bodies once they get on stage.
For sure. I think especially when the fans still want to go, that basically solves the debate.
Yeah,
It's easy for somebody who's sitting at home
yeah,
who's not interested to say you should retire, but I mean, for the fans at the stadium that sold out, they feel differently.
yeah. It's let the market decide. I mean, obviously some people are going to diss it and say they're too old, but I don't know. I think it takes balls and courage to keep going at that age, as long as as long as the show is still top notch, which with them, I can't imagine it not being. One of my favorite stories about ACDC, again, invoking Rick Rubin again, is he talks about being in the studio with him. And, Rick Rubin was like anxious to get the production going and produce a record and get things moving, get things done. And like, he didn't understand why like they would just stop and take smoke breaks for like 3 hours, just drink tea or coffee and smoke the whole time. And what he realized, which ended up being like kind of one of the principles of Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, was that was necessary for ACDC because it was the idea that there's two different types of distractions that take place in the creative process. One is distraction from the process, which is negative. The other is distraction in service of the act, in service of the art, which means that you have to sometimes walk away and smoke for 2 hours to let things ruminate and distill and to process how you're going to go back and do things differently or more in sync with the muse. And he realized that for ACDC, they needed 2 to 3 hour smoke breaks in the middle of a session to go
That's a
back
good way to get inspired.
and capture the lightning in the bottle that they always do. You know.
That is so amazing. And I remember Chris Slade told me too when he came on this show that ACDC never has done a sound check or a rehearsal for their concerts ever.
That's
Never,
amazing.
not a single one. They have people check their instruments, but they never have to
Yeah,
rehearse. So I was like, these guys are just the definition of true entertainers right there.
yeah.
But that's a sick story from Rick Rubin as well. Now I wanted to hop over to this. Gene Simmons is back in the news right now, telling people that you guessed it, rock and roll music is still dead in his view.
Mm.
Gene has been making headlines with this statement since I believe 2010, determined to convince us that rock and roll is dead. So we have a little quote here from Gene. He was speaking on the fact that most people in the modern day and age don't even know who Nirvana is if they were asked, which I don't know how many people Gene has been talking to outside, but I don't know if I agree. He says, "Who's the bass player in Nirvana? Most people wouldn't know what you're talking about or be able to sing a Nirvana song. By the way, I'm delusional enough to believe that some market reports about how the Kiss faces are the most recognizable on the planet. But I've tried this before, walk down the street and randomly ask people, and they won't get it." So Gene continues just to say basically, it's sort of a convoluted message here, Andrew, because he's saying that Kiss is basically the biggest in the world, but people don't know these other bands.
I think he's probably right on direction, maybe not timing. Like maybe
Yeah.
I don't know that it's dead, but it's certainly dying, and it doesn't look like it's reversing anytime quick, anytime soon. So that's sad. I was actually talking to a friend about this last night. Like it seems like rock only really gets spotlight these days when it's interspersed with rap or country, and like true rock and roll or hard rock or metal or whatever it might be is particularly like being popularized is struggling more and more and more and more, right? That the younger generations don't gravitate towards it as much as the older ones still do or try to. So I tend to think he's probably right on direction. I just don't think that we can issue the death certificate yet. I am heartened by like some of the subgenres of rock. My favorite, hardcore punk rock music. Like I see that there is a new generation coming up to you know carry the torch forward. It was probably 2 years ago. I went to the This Is Hardcore Fest in Philadelphia. My friend Joe puts on one of the biggest hardcore fests in the world. People come from all over the world, and it was like half the guys were like over 40 and still listening to the old quintessential hardcore bands, Sick of It All, Cro-Mags, Madball, Murphy's Law, all these old bands. But then half the crowd was like kids in their 20s, super enthusiastic, young bands who are awesome. Bands like Mind Force or Bug In or Ingrown or Pain of Truth, or this band Speed from Australia is amazing, and they've actually gotten a lot of traction. So like I feel like if you look at if you niche down, to go back to our earlier topic,
There we
that you can
go.
still find a lot of regeneration in the niches, but in the more popularized stuff like the AC/DC, or that, I think from from that level, I think it's having a tough go, and we'll see what the
Yeah,
future
I,
holds.
I think it's having a tough go, but it's such a mind, it's a confusing thing for my mind to wrap around because whenever I go to these concerts, they're still sold out. I recently went to Metallica just a couple of months ago. They did 2 nights in my city, sold out 65,000 seaters. And the craziest thing is, Andrew, that everybody around me was my own age. I figured I'd go to this concert and
Oh,
see a lot
really?
of,
Okay.
yeah, I figured I'd see, a lot of, classic people and people even older than my parents and this and that. No, it was like my whole section was just dudes in their 20s there to see Metallica, all different backgrounds, all different, creeds. So I was like, wow, this is fascinating. So I feel like maybe and here's my, answer to Gene Simmons if he's watching this. I think he's a big fan of the show, so he probably is. Um, One, why are you so excited to put the final nail in the coffin? Like, what's the rush for proclaiming that it's dead? But two, maybe it's just that they're not making rock and roll like they used to. Maybe we need somebody to step it up and
Yeah.
become the new Metallica, the new AC/DC, because it looks like there's a hunger for that music still.
Well, it goes back to like perennial artists versus regenerating with new artists, right? Like Metallica's perennial, AC/DC perennial, Kiss is perennial, right?
Right.
Uh, so like, but where's the new Metallica? Where's the
That's
new
the thing.
AC/DC?
But
Where's the
maybe
new
the music just isn't as good as it was then, and that's
right?
maybe why it's not succeeding. Because I guarantee
I
if
feel like
somebody
that's
put
what he's
out,
speaking. I mean, that's what I was speaking to when I was talking about
yeah,
it dying. So much that
yeah,
the old perennial bands don't draw. I didn't realize that their draw was equally or maybe even more with younger generations, which is awesome. But what happens when they pass, and where are the new bands that are
mm,
going to take that mantle that are young, right?
that's the thing. Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess I see it more of a symptom of the actual product than the interest. I think that Gene seems to have this sense that the interest for rock and roll is dead. But I think there's a hunger just like there was before. And Gene's shows are sold out as well. But again, these are bands that
Yeah.
are legacy acts.
Yeah. So maybe it's a supply problem, not a demand problem.
I think it
Well,
is. I think
yeah.
it is. But we have a lot of great groups out right now. And like you say, you niche down, you find more of them. Andrew, man, it's always great to chat with you. I could talk all day about this stuff. I know that there's plenty of topics to go through. What do you want the people to know? Obviously, we talked a lot about the book. You got your speaking stuff coming up.
Yeah. I just say if you haven't yet, take a risk, give it a shot, and go pick up Failure Rules, the 5 rules of failure for entrepreneurs, creatives, and authentics. All formats, ebook, hardcover, great audio book as well. Go give it a shot, check it out, and check me out at andrewthorpking.com or follow me on Instagram at Andrew Thorpe King, which is where I'm most active.
Andrew.